Before we begin, subscribe and leave a like for more untold history stories. In April 1945, the Third Reich was no longer a mighty empire. It was a graveyard burning under black smoke and endless fire. The streets of Berlin had become rivers of rubble, shattered concrete, and terrified civilians running through the ruins of what once was the most feared nation in Europe. Children barely old enough to hold rifles were being sent to die against Soviet tanks. Old men were dragged into hopeless battles. Millions were starving. And beneath the destroyed capital, hidden inside a cold concrete bunker, Adolf Hitler still believed Germany could somehow survive. What happened during the final days of Nazi Germany was not just the end of a war. It was the collapse of an empire that promised to last 1,000 years and died in only 12. At the height of its power, Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable. In only a few years, Hitler's armies had crushed Poland, invaded France, bombed Britain, and conquered nearly all of Europe with terrifying speed. German tanks rolled across borders like machines from another world. The Luftwaffe darkened entire skies. To millions around the world, the Third Reich looked invincible. Hitler promised his people glory, dominance, and an empire that would rule for generations. Massive rallies filled German cities with roaring crowds waving red banners beneath giant swastikas. Propaganda convinced ordinary citizens that Germany was destined to reshape the world forever. But beneath the speeches and military parades, the seeds of destruction were already growing. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union became a nightmare beyond imagination. Entire German armies froze and starved in the brutal Russian winter. Then came Stalingrad. Tens of thousands of German soldiers died trapped in ruins, surrounded by Soviet forces with no escape. It was one of the deadliest battles in human history, and from that moment on, Nazi Germany began bleeding to death. By 1944, the war had turned completely against Hitler. American bombers filled the skies day and night, reducing German cities to ashes. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath firestorms so massive they could be seen from miles away. Families slept underground inside subway tunnels while buildings collapsed above them. Food became scarce. Fuel disappeared. Trains stopped moving. Factories struggled to operate while Allied bombs shattered Germany piece by piece. Fear spread everywhere. Yet Nazi propaganda continued lying to the population, insisting that victory was still possible. Radio broadcasts promised miracle weapons that would supposedly save the Reich. But soldiers returning from the front knew the truth. Germany was losing, and it was losing badly. As Soviet forces advanced from the east and American troops pushed from the west, panic consumed the country. German officers began abandoning positions. Civilians fled their homes carrying whatever they could hold in their arms. Refugees crowded frozen roads while artillery thundered in the distance. Entire towns were swallowed by chaos. The once disciplined war machine of Nazi Germany was collapsing into desperation. Hitler, however, refused to surrender. Deep inside the Führer bunker beneath Berlin, he isolated himself from reality more and more each day. Witnesses described him as physically broken, trembling constantly, exhausted and consumed by paranoia. Yet even as enemy armies surrounded the capital, he continued ordering divisions that no longer existed to launch impossible counterattacks. Maps covered bunker walls while Hitler screamed at generals and blamed everyone except himself for Germany's destruction. Some officers knew the war was over. Others were too terrified to challenge him. Inside the bunker, reality itself seemed to disappear. Above them, Berlin was becoming hell on earth. Soviet artillery pounded the city without mercy. Explosions shook entire streets every few seconds. Smoke blocked the sunlight. Buildings burned endlessly across the horizon. German civilians hid in basements listening to tanks rumble outside, while terrified soldiers fought block by block against overwhelming Soviet forces. Teenagers from the Hitler Youth were handed anti-tank weapons and sent into suicidal battles against experienced Soviet troops. Many died within hours. Hospitals overflowed with wounded civilians and dying soldiers. Water systems collapsed. Electricity failed. Bodies filled the streets. The capital of the Third Reich had become a nightmare of fire, fear, and destruction. As the Soviets closed in, Hitler's mental state deteriorated even further. Reports from surviving witnesses described long moments of silence, interrupted by explosive rage. He accused his own people of weakness and betrayal. At one point, Hitler openly declared that Germany deserved to perish because it had failed him. The man who once promised eternal victory now sat underground listening to artillery destroy his empire above his head. Still, some loyal followers refused to abandon him. Senior Nazi officials remained inside the bunker, even as escape routes disappeared. Outside, Soviet troops were only streets away. Then on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler finally accepted the inevitable. After years of war, millions of deaths and unimaginable destruction, the dictator who had dragged the world into chaos chose to end his own life inside the bunker. According to witnesses, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide together, while Soviet forces closed around Berlin. Soon afterward, loyal aides carried their bodies outside and burned them in a desperate attempt to prevent them from being captured. Above ground, explosions continued shaking the city while smoke rose into the dark sky. The Third Reich had effectively died beneath the ruins of its own capital. But the suffering was far from over. Fighting continued across Berlin as desperate German soldiers resisted the inevitable collapse. Soviet troops advanced street by street through the destroyed city. Civilians emerged from underground shelters to witness a landscape that no longer resembled the Berlin they once knew. Entire districts had vanished beneath mountains of rubble. Fires still burned across shattered buildings. The dream of a thousand-year Reich had ended in starvation, ruins, and death. Only days later, Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. What remained afterward was almost impossible to comprehend. Millions were dead. Entire cities had been erased. Europe stood devastated by one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, and the regime that once terrified the world had collapsed completely in only 12 years. The final days of Nazi Germany were not glorious. They were not heroic. They were the terrifying consequences of fanaticism, war, and absolute power consumed by its own madness. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more untold moments from history, make sure to subscribe and leave a like, because some of the darkest chapters in human history still hide stories the world has never truly forgotten.